place of learning, not a place of failure. They did not accomplish what they wanted to accomplish. SNCC was there, CORE was there, a number of groups was there, but they didn't accomplish what they wanted to accomplish. And what was heightened all around the South and Tennessee and Mississippi and Alabama, Georgia, the head of segregation was rising in a very brutal way. And Dr. King, he gathered his men and he gathered his women, and they sat down and they said, we got to take this thing head on. That if we are going to win and we are going to have some success, we got to go to the harshest place in the South. And they decided to go to Birmingham. Birmingham had already had a movement. There was a strong group of African-American preachers and business people who were working hard to bring about social change. And they invited Dr. King to come. And when they got there, they faced sort of the same type of problems that they experienced in Albany. They were marching, they were protesting, they had planned to sit in at the downtown lunch counters. And so, my doctoral mentor, who I got my doctoral degree under, Dr. Wyatt T. Walker, who was the chief of staff for Dr. King, he said, we're gonna have to turn up the heat. We're gonna have to turn on the heat in order for the oppression and the hatred to rise up. We're going to have to become even more forceful. And Dr. Walker developed what is known as Project C, or Project Confrontation. And they would take masses of people into the hearts of department stores and in the heart of the oppression, if it was restaurants or cafes. And there was in Birmingham a sheriff called Bull Connor. Bull Connor was boiling over. He was a fat fella whose face would turn red when he was angry. And they knew that if they kept the pressure on, that Bull Connor would respond. And they would gather every evening at Kelly Ingram Park in the heart of the black community, in the heart of Birmingham. And the pressure was starting to rise, but Bull Connor was holding his temper. This is a piece of story that's so very important. While all of this is going on, there are student organizers rising in the high schools. Right around the corner from Kelly Ingram Park was a black high school. James Bevel and Dr. Wyatt Walker went to Dr. King, and he said that the students want to march and the students want to protest. And Dr. King said, no, it's too dangerous. I don't feel comfortable with it. But it becomes a time when people don't have to ask permission about their future. And if you know the history, it was on this particular day in the spring of 1963 that the young students, they walked out of this high school and they marched into Kelly Ingram Park. And Bull Connor could not hold his anger. And if you know the story, they turned the hoses, they turned the dogs, not just, listen to this, not just on the adults and the marchers, but they turned the hoses and the dogs on students. And it was captured on national TV. And we know that the movement reached its pinnacle. During that time, Dr. King had gone to jail already. He had written the letter from a Birmingham jail, but none of that moved until the young people. None of that moved until young people had the courage. Dr. King was young himself, in his early 30s. All of them were young men and women, but the young people who had been riding buses all across the country, who were protesting and getting beaten at cafes and lunch places in Birmingham, the high school students stood up. And we know as we keep going on, I'm running out of time, we know that during that same year we had the March on Washington, and Dr. King gave that great speech. And I always say and tell the story of how while we were marching and planning and inspiring one another, in August of '63 at the March on Washington, the white racists, the Ku Klux Klan, were planning. While we were marching and celebrating, they were planning. And a few weeks after the March on Washington is where those little boys and girls, those 4 girls were bombed at 16th Street Baptist Church. They got up that Sunday morning and went to church, middle-class church, parents really into church. They got up, they ate bacon and eggs and pancakes. They had their hair nicely done, put on their nice dresses, and they walked to Sunday school. Not only did they meet Jesus there, not only did they meet their classmates there, not only did they meet their teachers there, but they met hatred and they met a bomb. Oh, this ain't an easy walk. And so Dr. King moved from there, and he said he won the Nobel Peace Prize. And from there, he went to Norway, and he received the prize. And on his way back, he got word that there was a movement growing in Selma, Marion County, Alabama, to be exact. That the people there were saying that it's time for us to vote. There were counties that was 70, 80% black, but only 2%, 3% were allowed to vote. As soon as Dr. King got back, there were already a movement in Selma, but when Dr. King got back, something horrific happened. One of the people that I worked closely with, a young preacher at that time named James Orange, was there organizing. And while he was organizing, he got arrested. Marion County, right outside of Selma. And they had him in a jail. And the word got out that they were gonna lynch James. And so SCLC were there, SNCC was there, preachers was there, and they held a midnight march. And the Klan and the sheriffs, the Klan and the police, you see back then you couldn't tell the difference, depends on if they had a hood on or not. They came at midnight, it was a march at midnight, and they shot out the lights. And all of the marchers scattered. And there was a young man named Jimmy Lee Jackson who went and found his grandfather who had been in the march, and they ran down the alley. And the police came, and they started to shoot his grandfather, older man, probably had been in the movement all his life, opportunity to assassinate him. And this young preacher stood in front of the bullet for his grandfather and died. Right after that, here's the story, right after that, James Bevel, one of Dr. King's lieutenants, who was a scientist, he was a great mind, great organizer, but was fearless and angry. He said, I'm gonna take the body of Jimmy Lee Jackson and we're gonna march all the way to Montgomery and we're gonna sit it on the seat, all the way to Montgomery, we're gonna sit it on the seat of the state capitol. And they all convened and they said, no, you can't do that, don't do that, we're gonna plan a march. So Dr. King wasn't there, they had the first march in March, and that was the Sunday that became Bloody Sunday. They had the march, they were attempting to march from Selma to Montgomery. And they were met at the bottom of the Edmund Pettus Bridge. You got to go to Selma. At the bottom of Edmund Pettus Bridge, they were met by dogs and hoses and sheriffs. And these nonviolent marchers marched over the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and they turned the dogs on them, the hoses on them. And they beat John Lewis and Hosea Williams and Amelia Boyden. You can see the pictures. And they, on horses, they rode all the way up Edmund Pettus Bridge, beating people. It's very interesting because I went there for a tour of Selma, and we met a woman who was young. She was in the march, and she said, Dr. Mine, I want you to know that they only tell half the story. Because there were students in Selma who were there organizing people, and they were housed on over the bridge. There were several Baptist churches, and there was Brown Chapel AME Church, and she said all night the sheriffs and the Klan went into those churches, and they were beating the students all night. not just at the bottom of the bridge, but all night. And we know the story. They eventually had a second march, third march, and eventually there was the passage of the Voting Rights Act. Some things happened in Dr. King's life. Went to Chicago, went to Cleveland. They turned from civil rights to economic rights. They turned from civil rights to civil rights. He began to be concerned about not just only eating at the lunch counter, but owning the lunch counter. Somebody say, ma'am. And they began to change the movement. And Dr. King, he said, we're going to plan this Poor People's March. And they got together. They wanted to fight and deal with economic issues. I'm almost done. Economic issues in the nation. And they planned the Poor People's March. And in the midst of planning the Poor People's March, this is early 1968. Dr. King speaks about the war in Vietnam. He speaks against it. And he said, you know, we can't be just concerned about issues here, but we got to be concerned about issues all around the world, that at the heart of the poor people's movement, that resources that could be spent here in America is being spent in Vietnam on an unholy, evil war. In fact, my brothers and my sisters, it's important for us to know that Dr. King really wasn't killed on April 4th, 1968. He was really killed on April 4th, 1967, because it was April 4th, 1967 that he gave his speech, It's Time to Break Silence. He spoke at the Riverside Cathedral in New York when he came out against the Vietnam War. That's when all his friends turned against him. All of his supporters turned against him. They said, you should be dealing only with issues in the South and not with global issues. And we know the story that he got the call. He got the call about Memphis. He got the call about these poor sanitation workers. And people said, you know, you're working on the Poor People's Campaign. You don't need to be dealing with these poor sanitation workers. And Dr. King said, how can I not go to Memphis? And we know the story that he went to Memphis, was eventually assassinated. We know that the Poor People's Campaign did happen. And as a result of the Poor People's Campaign, a number of important public policy issues emerged, like HUD and HEW. There was the economic bill. There was positive things that came out of the Poor People's Campaign, but they killed the dreamer, but they didn't kill the dream. Eventually, as years went on, they would pass the Martin Luther King national holiday, and that's where we are today. What I come by to tell you today is that there are so many people that made King who King is. That King would not be who he is if there were not thousands of kings all around him. There were thousands of people in Albany, thousands of people in Montgomery, thousands of people in Birmingham who heard the voice crying inside of them to stand up. I come by to tell you that there's a king inside of you. You know, here in Cleveland, we're about to launch a voting rights video series in which we are teaching people how to do voting rights campaigns. And I'm giving one of the opening encouragements in that speech. And I'm talking about the fact that somebody that's going to hear this tape and somebody's going to hear this word is going to become an unnamed hero. Oh, I come by to tell you there are thousands of unnamed heroes, people who have done great and powerful things, and you may never know their names. People that owned businesses and they gave money to the movement only to have their businesses burned down in Mississippi. Pastors and churches and deacons who opened up the doors of their church that they would have voting rights training and voting rights campaigns out of their church, and their churches were burnt down. People in your family and my family, your great-great-grandfather, your great-great-grandmother, I come by to tell you that in all of our families, there was somebody lynched for standing up for righteousness, standing up for justice. There is a king inside of you. But before I take my seat, I want to just talk about 4 people